You know that feeling when you see potential in someone that nobody else can see? That's exactly what happened to me with Marcus. I was working at Henderson and Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm tucked between a Subway and a dry cleaner on Maple Street. The building had that old office smell of stale coffee and copy machine toner, and the fluorescent lights hummed constantly, like an annoying song you can't get out of your head. I'd been there for 6 years, working my way up from junior accountant to senior analyst, and I thought I understood how things worked. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought standing by someone through their struggles would create an unbreakable bond of trust. Boy, was I wrong. Marcus started on a Tuesday in March. I remember because it was raining that day. One of those cold, relentless downpours that makes you question why you live anywhere that isn't California. He walked in wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. And he had this nervous energy that reminded me of a rabbit caught in headlights. During the morning meeting, when our boss Janet introduced him to the team, I watched as he fumbled with his notepad, dropping his pen twice and apologizing in a voice barely above a whisper. The other guys, Rick and David, exchanged those knowing looks that said everything without saying anything. They'd already written him off before he'd even started his first task. But something about his determination, the way he straightened his shoulders despite his obvious anxiety, struck a chord with me. Maybe it was because I remembered my own first day 6 years earlier, when I'd been so nervous I'd accidentally printed 200 copies of the same report and spent my lunch break frantically trying to sort through them. He trembled during those first few meetings, and I mean actually trembled. His hands would shake when he had to present anything, even something as simple as a monthly expense summary. During client calls, his voice would crack like a teenager's, and more than once I watched him turn beet red when Janet asked him a direct question. The poor guy would stammer through his responses, often losing his train of thought halfway through and having to start over. It was painful to watch, really. The office culture at Henderson wasn't exactly nurturing. It was more of a sink or swim environment where showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Rick, who'd been there for 10 years and considered himself some kind of office alpha, would make subtle comments about Marcus's performance during coffee breaks. David, always eager to align himself with whoever seemed to have the most influence, would nod along and add his own observations about how some people just aren't cut out for client-facing work. I found myself intervening more and more, not in an obvious way, but with gentle nudges that helped Marcus navigate those treacherous early weeks. When he'd get flustered during presentations, I'd ask a clarifying question that gave him time to collect his thoughts. When Janet would fire rapid questions at him, I'd rephrase them in a way that was easier to answer. I told myself I was just being a good colleague, helping a new team member find his footing. The day that really sealed my commitment to helping Marcus was when he made that massive error with the Brennan Industries account. It was a Friday afternoon, around 4:30. And the office was already starting to empty out for the weekend. Marcus had been working on a complex financial reconciliation for our biggest client, and somehow he'd transposed 2 major figures in the final report. Instead of showing a profit margin of $340,000, his calculations showed a loss of $430,000. The error didn't just affect the current quarter. It threw off projections for the entire fiscal year. When Janet discovered the mistake Monday morning during her review, she was furious. I can still see her face, red with anger, as she called Marcus into her office. Through the glass walls, I watched him shrink into his chair as she gestured emphatically at the papers spread across her desk. When he came out 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His usually neat hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his shirt was wrinkled from nervous sweating. Janet had given him until end of business Tuesday to not only fix the error, but to explain to the client how it happened and what measures would be taken to prevent it in the future. That's when I made the decision that would come back to haunt me. Without really thinking it through, I walked into Janet's office and told her that I'd reviewed Marcus's work before it went out, that the error was as much my responsibility as his. It wasn't true. I hadn't reviewed anything. But seeing Marcus so defeated, So clearly drowning in a job that was already challenging enough without this kind of setback triggered something protective in me. Janet looked at me with surprise, then with a grudging respect. She'd always valued team accountability, and my willingness to share the blame seemed to confirm her belief that I was management material. The aftermath of that incident was complicated. Marcus never directly thanked me for covering for him, but there was a shift in our relationship. We started having coffee together in the break room, initially to discuss work, but gradually expanding to more personal topics. He told me about his background, how he'd struggled through college while working 2 jobs to support his sick mother, how this position at Henderson represented his first real shot at a stable career. I shared my own stories about the challenges of being one of only 3 women in a male-dominated office, about the subtle ways I'd learned to assert myself without being labeled as aggressive or emotional. These conversations usually happened around 10 in the morning, when the break room was relatively quiet and we could talk without interruption. Marcus would lean against the counter, cradling his coffee mug like it was a lifeline, and listen with an intensity that made me feel heard, in a way I rarely experienced at work. He had this way of asking follow-up questions that showed he was really paying attention, not just waiting for his turn to speak. During these talks, I began to see glimpses of the person he could become once he found his confidence. He had ideas, good ones, about process improvements and client relations. He just needed time and support to develop them. I found myself looking forward to these morning conversations, these islands of genuine connection in what was otherwise a pretty isolating work environment. But it was the laughing at the coffee station that really made me dig my heels in and decide to be Marcus's advocate. Rick and David had this habit of gathering around the coffee machine every afternoon around 3, when the post-lunch energy crash hit and everyone needed a caffeine boost. It was like their own little comedy show, except the jokes were always at someone else's expense. I'd overhear them making comments about Marcus's clothes, his accent which had slight traces of his rural Georgia upbringing, and especially his performance during meetings. Rick would do these cruel impressions of Marcus stumbling through presentations, mimicking his nervous stammering in an exaggerated way that made David laugh so hard he'd snort coffee through his nose. They thought they were being subtle, keeping their voices low and looking around to make sure they weren't overheard. But sound carries in those office spaces with their industrial carpeting and minimal sound dampening. One particularly nasty afternoon, Rick was describing how Marcus had mispronounced reconciliation during a client call, drawing out the syllables in a mocking southern drawl. That's when I'd had enough. I walked over to their little gathering and told them, in no uncertain terms, that their behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful. Rick tried to play it off as harmless fun, saying they were just blowing off steam and that Marcus probably couldn't even hear them from his desk across the office. I pointed out that it didn't matter whether Marcus could hear them or not, that talking about a colleague that way created a toxic work environment for everyone. David, ever the follower, mumbled something about not meaning any harm, but Rick doubled down. He told me I was being too sensitive, and that maybe I should focus on my own work instead of playing mother hen to someone who clearly wasn't cut out for this business. Even after I'd made my position clear, the gossip continued, just more quietly. But at least I'd established that I wouldn't tolerate it in my presence. The email incident was what really showed me how much Marcus had come to depend on my support, and how little he valued it. He'd been tasked with reaching out to a potential new client, a small manufacturing company that was looking to switch accounting firms. The initial contact was supposed to be professional, but warm, introducing Henderson's services, while highlighting our experience with businesses in their industry. Marcus had written what could only be described as a disaster. The tone was either too formal to the point of being cold, or too casual to the point of being inappropriate. He'd included unnecessary technical jargon that would have confused rather than impressed a potential client, and he'd made several factual errors about our firm's history and capabilities. Worst of all, he'd somehow managed to misspell the client's company name 3 different ways in the same email. When he asked me to take a quick look at his draft before sending it, I realized that a quick look wasn't going to be enough. The entire thing needed to be rewritten from scratch. I spent my lunch hour completely restructuring his message, researching the client company to ensure accuracy, and crafting a tone that was both professional and approachable. When I handed it back to him, he read through it quickly and said, "Great, this looks much better. Good thing I have you to catch these things. Not thank you. Not, I really appreciate the time you spent on this. Just an acknowledgement that my help was expected and convenient." I should have recognized that comment as a red flag. Should have seen it as evidence that Marcus viewed my support not as a gift freely given, but as a service he was entitled to receive. Instead, I told myself that he was just stressed, that once he got more comfortable in his role, he'd be more appreciative of the help he was getting. I kept rewriting his emails, kept covering for his mistakes, kept believing that my investment in his success would eventually pay dividends in the form of genuine loyalty and friendship. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was, how completely I misread the situation. I thought I was building an alliance, creating the kind of professional relationship where we'd have each other's backs through thick and thin. I believed that by showing Marcus unconditional support during his most vulnerable period, I was establishing a foundation of trust that would define our working relationship for years to come. What I was actually doing was enabling his dependence, while teaching him that my help was something he could take for granted. Every time I intervened to save him from embarrassment or failure, I was also demonstrating that I would prioritize his comfort over my own workload, his reputation over my own professional boundaries. I was so focused on being the kind of colleague I wished I'd had during my own difficult early days that I never stopped to consider whether Marcus would be willing to return the favor when I needed it. The signs were all there, if I'd been willing to see them. The way he'd accept my help without question, but never offered assistance in return. The way he'd smile and nod when I shared my own work challenges but never follow up later to see how things had gone. The way he seemed to view our relationship as fundamentally asymmetrical, with me in the role of mentor and protector, and him in the role of grateful but passive recipient. I told myself that this imbalance was temporary, that as Marcus grew more confident and competent, our relationship would evolve into something more equal and reciprocal. I convinced myself that I was playing the long game, investing in a partnership that would serve both of us well as we advanced in our careers. What I failed to understand was that Marcus was also playing the long game, that his strategy was entirely different from mine. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday in October, about 7 months after Marcus had started. The leaves outside the conference room window were just beginning to turn, and there was that crisp autumn feeling in the air that usually made me optimistic about new beginnings. I should have known better. I'd been leading the Morrison project for 3 months at that point, a complex restructuring proposal for a family-owned restaurant chain that had been struggling with cash flow issues. It was exactly the kind of high-visibility, challenging work that could make or break a career at Henderson. Janet had specifically chosen me to head the project, saying she wanted someone with fresh perspective and proven analytical skills to take the lead. I'd thrown myself into it completely, working late nights and weekends, diving deep into Morrison's financial history, interviewing key stakeholders, and developing what I genuinely believed was an innovative solution to their problems. Marcus had been assigned to my team as a junior analyst, supposedly to help with data collection and basic research. By this point in his tenure, he'd gained some confidence and was making fewer obvious mistakes, though he still relied heavily on my guidance for anything complex. The presentation was scheduled for 10 in the morning, and I'd been preparing for weeks. The Morrison family would be there, along with Janet, our senior partner Mr. Henderson himself, and the entire account management team. It was the kind of meeting where careers are made, where junior analysts prove they're ready for bigger responsibilities. I arrived at the office at 7:30 that morning to run through my slides one final time, checking and double-checking every number, every projection, every recommendation. Marcus arrived around 8:15, looking unusually polished in a new navy suit that actually fit him properly. He seemed nervous but excited, and I remember thinking how far he'd come since those early days. when he could barely string together a coherent sentence during team meetings. We reviewed the presentation together one last time, with me walking him through his supporting role and making sure he understood the key data points he might be asked to explain. Everything felt solid, well-rehearsed, ready for success. I had this feeling in my chest, that mixture of nervousness and anticipation that comes when you know you've done excellent work and you're about to get the recognition you deserve. I thought this meeting would be the turning point that established me as a real leader within the firm, someone capable of handling major client relationships and complex strategic thinking. When the Morrison family arrived, I could tell immediately that the dynamics were going to be challenging. John Morrison, the patriarch who'd built the business from a single diner into a 12-location chain, had that old-school skepticism about working with women that he tried to hide behind forced politeness. His son Peter, who'd recently taken over day-to-day operations, seemed more open-minded but clearly deferred to his father's judgment on major decisions. Janet introduced me as the project lead, emphasizing my experience and the thoroughness of the analysis I'd conducted. I launched into the presentation feeling confident and well-prepared, walking them through Morrison's current financial situation, identifying the key problem areas and building toward my proposed solution. The plan involved consolidating 3 underperforming locations, renegotiating lease terms on the remaining properties, and implementing a new inventory management system that would reduce waste and improve margins. It was solid work, backed by months of research and conservative financial projections that showed a clear path to profitability within 18 months. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. I fielded questions about market analysis and competitive positioning with ease, demonstrating the depth of knowledge I'd gained about their industry. Marcus contributed when appropriate, providing supporting data and clarifying technical details with a competence that made me proud of how much he'd developed. The trouble started when John Morrison questioned one of my key recommendations about staffing reductions. He seemed to take it personally, interpreting my suggestion to streamline management structure as a criticism of how he'd built his business. His voice got progressively louder as he defended decisions he'd made 20 years earlier, decisions that might have made sense then, but were clearly contributing to current inefficiencies. I tried to acknowledge his concerns while explaining why changes were necessary, but he kept interrupting, talking over me, treating my carefully researched recommendations as naive suggestions from someone who didn't understand the real world of business. That's when I made the mistake of showing passion for my work. When he dismissed my analysis of labor costs as theoretical nonsense, I responded with conviction, my voice rising slightly as I defended the methodology I'd used and the accuracy of my conclusions. I wasn't shouting or being unprofessional, but I was clearly invested in the discussion, clearly committed to helping his business succeed. That's when Janet, my own boss who had assigned me to lead this project, said the words that would echo in my mind for months afterward. Sarah, I think you're getting a bit too emotional about this. Let's take a step back and approach this more objectively. The room went dead silent. John Morrison sat back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, as if my supposed emotionality had confirmed his suspicions about working with women. Peter looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Marcus, sitting directly across from me, stared down at his notepad as if the numbers there had suddenly become fascinating. The word emotional hit me like a physical blow. I'd been called many things in my career: demanding, perfectionist, detail-oriented to a fault, but never emotional. Everything I'd said had been backed by data, supported by research, grounded in sound financial analysis. My passion for the work, my commitment to helping the client succeed, was being reframed as female hysteria, as evidence that I couldn't handle the pressure of high-stakes business discussions. I felt my face flush hot with a combination of anger and humiliation, but I also knew that any reaction I showed now would only reinforce the narrative that I was too emotional for this kind of responsibility. So I took a deep breath, apologized for my intensity, and continued with the presentation in a deliberately calm, measured tone that felt completely unnatural. The rest of the meeting was a disaster. Every point I made was met with skepticism. Every recommendation questioned as if it came from someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. John Morrison, emboldened by Janet's implicit criticism of my approach, began directing his questions to Marcus instead of me, asking him to clarify points I just explained, seeking his opinion on recommendations I'd developed. Marcus, to his credit, initially tried to redirect attention back to me, saying things like, "Sarah can explain that better than I can," or "That's really Sarah's area of expertise." But as the meeting progressed and it became clear which way the wind was blowing, his responses became less deferential to my leadership and more independently confident. After the meeting ended and the Morrison family had left to consider their options, Janet called me into her office for what she described as a debrief session. The conversation was devastating in its casualness, the way she discussed my performance as if the problems were obvious and my emotional reaction was just another item on a checklist of professional development needs. She told me that while my analytical work was solid, I needed to work on my presentation style, particularly my tendency to take things personally when clients push back. She suggested that I might benefit from some coaching on managing my reactions under pressure, framing it as an investment in my professional growth, rather than a criticism of my competence. When I tried to explain that I hadn't been emotional, that I'd simply been advocating strongly for well-researched recommendations, she cut me off with a gentle smile and said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah. You're getting defensive instead of hearing the feedback." It was like being trapped in quicksand. Every attempt to defend myself only proved her point about my alleged emotional instability. The most crushing part was when she mentioned that Marcus had shown real poise under pressure during the meeting, handling the client's aggressive questions with impressive professionalism. She suggested that I could learn something from his calm, measured approach to difficult conversations. Here was someone I'd mentored, someone whose confidence I'd built from nothing, being held up as an example of the professional behavior I was supposedly lacking. That night, I went home to my one-bedroom apartment and sat on my couch for 2 hours without turning on any lights, just processing what had happened. I kept replaying the meeting in my mind, analyzing every word I'd said, every gesture I'd made, trying to understand how advocating for my work had been interpreted as emotional instability. I thought about all the times I'd seen male colleagues raise their voices in meetings, pound tables for emphasis, argue passionately for their positions, and be praised for their commitment and leadership. I remembered Rick getting into a shouting match with a client 6 months earlier, defending his approach so aggressively that the client actually apologized and accepted his recommendations. Janet had called it impressive advocacy and used it as an example during our next team meeting of how to handle pushback with confidence. But when I showed conviction, when I defended work I believed in, it was labeled as too emotional, too personal. Evidence that I couldn't maintain professional objectivity. The double standard was so obvious, so glaring, that I couldn't understand how people didn't see it. But what hurt even more than Janet's criticism was Marcus's silence during the meeting, his failure to support me when I was being unfairly characterized. He'd sat there and watched me be diminished, had even seemed to benefit from the contrast between my supposed emotionality and his calm professionalism. This was the person I'd defended against office gossip, whose work I'd corrected and improved, whose confidence I'd built through months of patient mentoring. And when I needed him to speak up, when I needed him to acknowledge my leadership and the quality of my work, he'd chosen silence over loyalty. The betrayal didn't announce itself with dramatic confrontations or heated arguments. It arrived quietly, through an email signature that appeared in my inbox on a Monday morning in November. 3 weeks after the Morrison meeting disaster, I was sitting at my desk with my usual cup of coffee from the diner across the street, scrolling through weekend emails and trying to get mentally prepared for another week of walking on eggshells around Janet. The office felt different lately, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made everyday interactions feel like carefully choreographed performances. I'd been working extra hard to prove that I could be objective and professional, swallowing my opinions during meetings and presenting, my ideas with an almost robotic calm that felt completely foreign to my natural communication style. Marcus had been acting strange too, more distant during our morning coffee conversations, often claiming he was too busy to chat or had early meetings to prepare for. I'd attributed it to general workplace stress, assuming he was feeling the pressure that always comes with the fourth quarter push toward year-end deadlines. I was completely unprepared for what I was about to discover. The email itself was routine, just Marcus forwarding me some client documents I'd requested for a follow-up report on the Morrison account. Janet had decided to keep me on the project despite everything, though in a reduced capacity that felt more like punishment than opportunity. But it wasn't the content of the email that stopped me cold. It was the signature line at the bottom. Marcus Thompson, Assistant Manager, Strategic Accounts, Henderson and Associates. I stared at those words for what felt like 5 minutes, reading them over and over, as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Assistant Manager. When had that happened? How had that happened? I scrolled back through recent company communications, searched my email for any announcements I might have missed, checked the company intranet for organizational updates. Nothing. No formal announcement, no congratulatory team message, no explanation of new reporting structures or responsibilities. It was as if Marcus had quietly slipped into a promotion while everyone was looking the other way, as if his advancement was so natural and expected that it didn't warrant any fanfare or explanation. But I knew better. I knew how these things worked at Henderson, how promotions were typically announced with company-wide emails and updated organizational charts posted in the break room. The silence around Marcus's elevation felt deliberate, calculated, designed to avoid uncomfortable questions about timing and qualifications. My first instinct was to walk over to his desk and ask him directly what was going on, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was a growing awareness that our relationship had fundamentally changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. Instead, I called my friend Lisa, who worked in HR at a competing firm, someone I could trust to give me perspective without judgment. Over lunch at the little Italian place on 4th Street, I told her the whole story, from Marcus's early struggles to my mentoring efforts to the Morrison meeting debacle, and now this mysterious promotion. Lisa listened with the focused attention of someone who'd seen similar dynamics play out in her own workplace, nodding at key moments and asking clarifying questions that helped me see the situation more clearly. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, twirling pasta around her fork while choosing her words carefully. "Sarah," she said finally, "it sounds like you were so focused on helping Marcus succeed that you forgot to protect your own position. And now he's moved up while you're still dealing with the fallout from that meeting." She pointed out something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, that Marcus's promotion, coming so soon after the Morrison presentation, suggested he'd been positioned as a safer, more reliable alternative to my supposedly emotional leadership style. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was strategic. The most painful part wasn't just learning about the promotion after the fact. It was realizing how completely I'd been excluded from the process. In a healthy workplace, when someone you'd mentored was being considered for advancement, you'd expect to be consulted, to have your opinions sought about their readiness and capabilities. At minimum, you'd expect a heads-up, a courtesy notification that changes were coming. But Marcus's elevation had happened entirely outside my awareness, in conversations and meetings I wasn't part of, through a decision-making process that apparently didn't value my insights, despite months of close collaboration. I started paying closer attention to office dynamics, noticing things I'd previously overlooked or dismissed. The way Marcus had been having more frequent closed-door meetings with Janet over the past month. The way he'd started carrying himself differently, with a confidence that seemed less about personal growth and more about inside knowledge. The way certain conversations would stop when I entered the break room, as if my presence was interrupting discussions I wasn't meant to hear. It was like discovering that a parallel version of office life had been operating alongside the one I knew, with key decisions being made and relationships being formed in spaces I couldn't access. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. the feeling that I was somehow outside the real power structure of the organization, despite my years of experience and proven competence. The shift in our daily interactions became impossible to ignore once I knew about the promotion. Marcus stopped joining me for our morning coffee conversations, claiming he needed to arrive earlier to prepare for new responsibilities. When we did interact during meetings or project discussions, there was a formality that hadn't existed before, a professional distance that felt deliberately constructed. He no longer asked for my input on complex problems or sought my advice on client communications. Instead, he seemed to be establishing his independence, demonstrating that he could handle his new role without relying on the mentorship that had gotten him there. It was like watching someone erase the history of our collaboration, rewriting the narrative of his success to minimize my contributions. The few times I tried to engage him in the kind of substantive work discussions we used to have, he'd respond with polite but generic comments that could have come from anyone in the office. "That's an interesting perspective, Sarah. I'll take that into consideration. Let me think about that and get back to you." These weren't the responses of someone who valued my expertise. They were the careful words of someone managing a relationship that had become professionally inconvenient. I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of the person I thought I'd known, hoping to find some evidence that our connection had been real and meaningful, rather than purely transactional. The coffee ritual had been sacred to us for months, a daily touchstone that provided continuity and connection in an otherwise chaotic work environment. We'd meet every morning at 10:15, after the initial rush of emails and before the day's meetings kicked into high gear. Marcus would already be there when I arrived, having learned my preferences and timing through months of shared conversation. He'd gotten into the habit of buying my coffee for me, a small gesture that felt significant in its consistency and thoughtfulness. We'd stand by the window that overlooked the parking lot, discussing everything from weekend plans to work challenges, to our dreams for career advancement. These conversations had felt genuine, unmarked by the political calculations and careful positioning that characterized most workplace relationships. I'd shared things with Marcus during these coffee breaks that I hadn't told other colleagues, personal struggles and professional insecurities that revealed my humanity behind the competent facade I maintained in meetings. He'd done the same, opening up about his financial pressures, his fear of failure, his gratitude for having found a place where he could finally succeed. Or so I'd thought. Now, standing alone in that same spot every morning, I had to confront the possibility that these intimate conversations had been less meaningful to him than they'd been to me, that perhaps he'd viewed them as networking opportunities rather than genuine friendship. The absence of our coffee routine created a daily reminder of how thoroughly things had changed, how completely he'd moved on from needing my support or valuing my company. When I finally saw Marcus in his new office space, positioned strategically near Janet's door, where he could monitor the flow of high-priority meetings and important visitors, the physical representation of his advancement hit me harder than I'd expected. His old desk had been in the main bullpen area, surrounded by other junior staff and positioned where senior employees could easily check on his work. The new office wasn't large, just a converted conference room with glass walls and a door that actually closed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. He now had privacy for sensitive conversations, status that commanded respect from support staff, and physical proximity to decision-makers that would accelerate his access to important information and opportunities. I watched him through those glass walls during my first week of awareness, noting how naturally he seemed to inhabit the space, how quickly he'd adapted to the rhythms and responsibilities of his elevated position. There was no awkwardness or imposter syndrome, no sign that he felt undeserving of the role or uncertain about his capabilities. Instead, he projected the quiet confidence of someone who'd always known this advancement was coming, someone who'd been preparing for this moment, even while I'd been focused on day-to-day mentoring and support. The realization was devastating. While I'd been investing in what I thought was our mutual success, he'd been positioning himself for individual advancement at my expense. The cruelest part of what came next wasn't dramatic confrontation or public embarrassment. It was the slow, systematic erasure of my presence and contributions, death by 1,000 small cuts that left me questioning my own perception of reality. Professional ostracism doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. It seeps in through missed invitations, forgotten acknowledgements, and the gradual shift from inclusion to invisibility. I'd experienced workplace politics before, the usual jockeying for position and recognition that happens in any competitive environment, but this felt different. This felt personal and deliberate, as if my very existence had become inconvenient to the new order Marcus and Janet were establishing. The exclusion started small, with strategic meetings I somehow wasn't informed about until after they'd happened. I'd arrive at work to find my colleagues discussing decisions that had been made in my absence, referencing conversations and agreements I knew nothing about. When I'd ask about these missed communications, I'd get vague explanations about scheduling conflicts or assumptions that I was too busy with other projects to participate. But I wasn't too busy, and my calendar was visible to anyone who cared to check it. What I was becoming was irrelevant to the direction the company was heading, surplus to requirements in a structure that increasingly centered around Marcus's rising influence and Janet's apparent confidence in his judgment over mine. The meeting that should have included me happened on a Wednesday in December, just 2 weeks before Christmas, when the office was already operating at reduced capacity, and people's attention was divided between year-end deadlines and holiday preparations. I learned about it through pure accident, overhearing Jennifer from accounting mention to someone in the elevator that she'd been surprised to see me in the office during the big strategy session yesterday. When I told her I hadn't been in any strategy session, her face went pale with the realization that she'd just revealed something I wasn't supposed to know. The meeting had apparently covered planning for the next fiscal year, including resource allocation, client relationship management, and team restructuring. These were topics that directly affected my role and responsibilities, areas where my experience and insights should have been valuable contributions to the decision-making process. But somehow, my name had been left off the invitation list while junior staff members and even interns had been included to take notes and provide administrative support. When I approached Janet's assistant to ask about the oversight, she looked genuinely confused and promised to check on it. But later that day she sent me an email saying the meeting had been internal leadership only, and that relevant decisions would be communicated through normal channels. Internal leadership. The phrase stung because it clarified exactly where I stood in the new hierarchy. Despite my years of experience and proven track record, I was no longer considered leadership material, no longer someone whose input was valued in strategic discussions about the future of the organization. The feedback session that came after my inquiry about the missed meeting was a masterpiece of professional gaslighting, delivered with the kind of concerned sympathy that made it impossible to argue against, without seeming defensive or unstable. Janet scheduled it as a check-in conversation, and began by expressing appreciation for my dedication and hard work over the past several months. She acknowledged that the transition period following the Morrison presentation had been challenging for everyone, and that she wanted to make sure I was feeling supported and valued as a team member. But then came the gentle suggestions for improvement, delivered with the careful tone of someone helping a struggling employee see their blind spots. She mentioned that I seemed to be having difficulty adapting to changes in team dynamics, that my communication style sometimes came across as resistant to new leadership structures. When I asked for specific examples, she provided vague references to times when I'd seemed less than enthusiastic about Marcus's ideas during team meetings, or when I'd asked too many detailed questions about decisions that had already been finalized. The picture she painted was of someone who was struggling to accept the natural evolution of workplace relationships, someone whose attachment to past ways of doing things was preventing them from embracing positive changes. It was expertly crafted criticism that left me no room to defend myself without proving her points about my allegedly problematic attitude. Every attempt to clarify my perspective or provide context for my actions was reframed as evidence of the very resistance she was describing. The most devastating blow came when I discovered that the comprehensive client analysis I'd spent weeks preparing had been presented to senior management with Marcus's name as the primary author, and my contributions relegated to a brief acknowledgement in the appendix. I found out through Rick, of all people, who mentioned in passing how impressed everyone had been with Marcus's innovative approach to competitive analysis. The report covered market positioning strategies for 3 major clients, including detailed recommendations for service, expansion and pricing adjustments that could potentially generate significant new revenue. I'd worked nights and weekends to complete the research, interviewing industry contacts, analyzing competitor offerings, and developing financial projections that demonstrated clear paths to growth. The work represented some of my best analytical thinking, the kind of strategic insight that had originally earned me recognition as a rising talent within the firm. But somehow, in the version that reached senior management, my role had been minimized to research support, while Marcus was credited with the strategic vision and recommendations that had actually originated from my analysis. When I raised this concern with Janet, she seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction, explaining that Marcus had synthesized and presented the materials so effectively that it made sense to position him as the lead analyst. She suggested that I was focusing too much on individual credit, rather than celebrating the team's collective success, that my concern about attribution revealed a troubling ego investment that wasn't aligned with collaborative workplace values. The exclusion extended beyond formal work products to the informal networks that really determine influence and advancement in any organization. Office celebrations that had previously included everyone now seemed to have guest lists that somehow overlooked my participation. Birthday gatherings, promotion announcements, farewell parties for departing colleagues. I'd hear about these events after they'd happened, through casual mentions and conversations or photos posted on the company bulletin board. When I'd ask why I hadn't been invited, I'd get apologetic explanations about miscommunication or assumptions that I wouldn't be interested in attending. But the pattern was too consistent to be accidental, too systematic to be the result of innocent oversight. What was happening was the deliberate construction of a social environment where my absence had become normal, where gatherings could proceed without anyone noticing or caring that I wasn't there. The message was clear. I was no longer considered part of the inner circle, no longer someone whose presence was valued or whose feelings needed to be considered when planning office social activities. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be at the center of every celebration, hosting impromptu happy hours and organizing lunch outings that strengthened the bonds between him and other influential colleagues. He'd become the social hub that I'd never managed to be, the person others gravitated toward for both professional collaboration and personal connection. The final insult was the performance review that arrived just before the holiday break, a document that read like it had been written about someone I didn't recognize. The language was professional and technically positive, acknowledging my technical skills and attention to detail, while simultaneously undermining any sense of my value as a strategic contributor. I was described as reliable and thorough, but lacking in leadership presence and adaptability to changing team dynamics. The review praised my historical contributions while suggesting that my future role might be better suited to individual contributor responsibilities rather than client-facing leadership positions. Reading between the lines, it was clear that I was being positioned for lateral movement at best, possibly elimination if I couldn't adjust my attitude and approach to better align with new organizational priorities. The review included goals for improvement that were impossible to measure objectively, demonstrate greater flexibility in collaborative environments, show increased openness to diverse leadership styles, develop stronger relationships with evolving team structures. These weren't performance metrics. They were personality adjustments designed to make me more compliant with decisions I had no input in making. The most crushing part was the section on peer feedback, where anonymous colleagues had apparently described me as sometimes difficult to work with and resistant to new ideas. The specificity of the language made it clear that these weren't random, observations but coordinated messages designed to support a predetermined narrative about my professional limitations and interpersonal challenges. That night, I sat in my car in the office parking lot for 20 minutes after finishing the performance review, watching colleagues leave for their holiday breaks while I processed the systematic destruction of my professional reputation. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time I finally started my engine. Just a few cars belonging to the cleaning crew and the security guard who worked the evening shift. The building that had once felt like a place where I could build a meaningful career now looked like a fortress designed to keep me out, its lit windows revealing conversations and collaborations I was no longer part of. I thought about all the times I'd stayed late to finish projects, all the weekends I'd spent preparing presentations, all the personal sacrifices I'd made in service of what I'd believed was our collective success. But there was no collective in this story, no shared victory or mutual advancement. There was only the harsh reality that while I'd been focused on building bridges and supporting teammates, others had been constructing ladders for their own advancement, using my loyalty and dedication as stepping stones to reach heights I'd helped make possible, but would never be invited to share. The humiliation wasn't in any single devastating moment. It was in the gradual recognition that I'd been written out of my own professional story, relegated from protagonist to supporting character in a narrative that no longer had room for my voice or vision. The call to Janet's office came on a Tuesday in February, delivered through her assistant with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed its ominous undertones. "Janet would like to see you at 3:30. If that works with your schedule." The phrasing was polite, but not really a request, and the timing felt deliberately chosen for maximum psychological impact. 3:30 meant I'd spend the entire afternoon knowing something significant was coming, unable to focus on any meaningful work while my mind raced through possibilities and preparations. I'd been through enough corporate restructurings and personnel changes to recognize the signs, the careful scheduling, the involvement of HR representatives who suddenly appeared in the office without explanation, the way conversations stopped when I entered common areas. The writing had been on the wall for weeks, ever since the holiday break when I'd returned to find my access to certain client files mysteriously restricted, and my name removed from distribution lists for strategic planning documents. But knowing something is coming and experiencing it are entirely different forms of emotional preparation, and nothing could have prepared me for the casual brutality of how my termination was actually handled. The meeting itself was a masterclass in corporate efficiency, stripped of any pretense that this was anything other than a predetermined conclusion to a process I'd never been allowed to participate in. Janet was there, along with Patricia from HR and Marcus, whose presence felt like the most deliberate insult of all. They'd arranged themselves around the small conference table in Janet's office like a tribunal, with documents spread out that had clearly been prepared in advance and legal language that had been reviewed by people far above my pay grade. Janet began with the kind of scripted sympathy that human resources departments train managers to deliver, acknowledging my years of service and expressing appreciation for my contributions while carefully avoiding any language that might be construed as admission of wrongful termination. "Sarah, we've made the difficult decision to restructure your position as part of our ongoing efforts to optimize team efficiency and client service delivery." The words were chosen for their legal safety rather than their honesty. Corporate speak designed to obscure the personal nature of what was happening behind a veneer of organizational necessity. Patricia took over to explain the logistics. My last day would be Friday. I'd received 2 weeks of severance pay, and my health insurance would continue through the end of the month. The timeline was breathtakingly fast, designed to minimize disruption to operations and limit my opportunities to challenge or negotiate the terms of my departure. What made the whole experience surreal was how normal everyone seemed, how completely comfortable they appeared with dismantling my livelihood, as if it were just another item on their daily task list. Janet maintained the same tone she used for budget reviews or client status updates, professional but detached, focused on process rather than the human impact of what was happening. Patricia shuffled through paperwork with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd conducted dozens of these conversations, checking boxes and gathering signatures with bureaucratic precision. But it was Marcus's presence that felt most like a calculated cruelty, a final demonstration of how completely the power dynamics had shifted since his arrival. He sat quietly throughout most of the meeting, occasionally nodding when Janet referenced changes in team structure or new directions in client management, but never making eye contact with me, and never acknowledging the role our relationship had played in bringing us to this moment. His silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was confident, the silence of someone who knew he belonged in this room, making decisions about other people's futures. When Janet mentioned that he'd be taking over responsibility for my current client accounts, he accepted the additional duties with the kind of gracious professionalism that suggested he'd been preparing for this transition for quite some time. There was no surprise in his expression, no indication that my termination was unexpected news that required adjustment or consideration. The most devastating part wasn't the job loss itself, though the financial implications were certainly frightening given my limited savings and the competitive job market in our industry. What destroyed me was the complete absence of any recognition for what I'd contributed to the organization. Any acknowledgement that my departure represented a loss of institutional knowledge or client relationships that had taken years to develop. The conversation proceeded as if I were an easily replaceable component in a machine that would continue running smoothly once the defective part had been removed and discarded. There was no discussion of transition planning beyond the basic transfer of files and contact information. No expression of regret about losing my expertise or concern about maintaining continuity in client service. Janet mentioned that they'd already begun identifying external candidates to fill the restructured position, which told me that my role hadn't actually been eliminated, but rather redesigned around someone else's qualifications and approach. The subtext was clear. They weren't just letting me go. They were actively planning to replace me with someone who better fit their vision of what this position should be. Marcus would serve as interim manager for my accounts until they could find a permanent replacement, someone who presumably wouldn't have the interpersonal challenges and attitude problems that had made my continued employment untenable. When they asked if I had any questions about the termination process or the paperwork I'd need to complete, I found myself strangely calm, almost detached from the magnitude of what was happening. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the relief of finally reaching the end of months of tension and uncertainty, but I felt an unexpected clarity about the futility of fighting or arguing with their decision. The process had been designed to be irreversible, the outcome predetermined by conversations and evaluations I'd never been part of, influenced by factors I could only guess at but never definitively prove. Any protest I might make would only reinforce their narrative about my inability to accept feedback and adapt to changing circumstances. Any emotion I showed would be interpreted as evidence of the instability they'd already documented in my personnel file. So I nodded and asked practical questions about logistics, when I should return my company laptop, how to access my final paycheck, whether there were any restrictions on my ability to contact former clients or colleagues. These mundane details felt safer than engaging with the larger questions of fairness or justice that were swirling in my mind but would have no constructive outlet in this carefully orchestrated proceeding. Patricia seemed almost relieved by my cooperative attitude, probably accustomed to more dramatic reactions from employees who were less prepared for their dismissal or more willing to fight against decisions they perceived as unjust. The walk back to my desk felt like a funeral march, with colleagues glancing up from their work just long enough to register what was happening before quickly looking away to avoid the awkwardness of witnessing someone's professional demise. Word travels fast in office environments, and I could sense that news of my termination was already spreading through the informal networks that carry information faster than any official communication. By the time I reached my workstation, the atmosphere in the bullpen had shifted subtly, conversations becoming quieter and more focused as people processed the implications of my departure for their own job security and career prospects. I began the strange ritual of packing up 6 years of accumulated work life into a cardboard box that Patricia had thoughtfully provided, sorting through files and personal items while trying to maintain some dignity in what felt like an inherently humiliating process. There were photos from office parties where I was smiling alongside colleagues who now couldn't meet my eyes. Awards and commendations that seemed to mock the very idea that good performance provides any protection against corporate politics. And personal touches like a coffee mug and desk plant that had made this workspace feel like home for so many years. The most painful items to pack were the thank you notes from clients who'd appreciated my work, handwritten messages that represented genuine professional relationships I'd built through competence and dedication, rather than strategic positioning or political maneuvering. As I carried my box toward the exit, passing Marcus's new office with its glass walls and strategic position near the centers of power, I caught a glimpse of him on a phone call, already deep in conversation about some client matter that had probably been my responsibility just hours earlier. He looked up for just a moment as I walked by, and our eyes met through the glass. There was no malice in his expression, no triumph or satisfaction, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that could have been interpreted as sympathy or indifference depending on your perspective. But there was also no gesture of support, no indication that he recognized any obligation to acknowledge our shared history or express regret about how things had ended. It was the look of someone who'd already moved on, who viewed my departure as a necessary step in his own professional evolution rather than a human tragedy deserving of empathy or reflection. In that moment, I understood with crystal clarity that whatever relationship I thought we had, whatever loyalty and mutual support I believed we'd built, had been entirely one-sided from the beginning. I hadn't been mentoring a grateful colleague. I'd been providing free consulting services to someone who'd always seen me as a temporary resource, rather than a lasting ally. The hardest part about sudden unemployment isn't the financial pressure, or the uncertainty about the future, though those challenges are real and immediate. It's the complete disruption of identity that comes when the structure that defined your days, your sense of purpose, and your social connections disappears overnight. I woke up that first Monday morning to the sound of my alarm clock, the same reliable 6:30 buzzer that had been starting my weekdays for 6 years. And for a split second I felt the familiar rush of anticipation before reality crashed back down. There was nowhere to go, no meetings to prepare for, no emails demanding immediate attention, no sense of being needed or valued by anyone for anything. The silence in my apartment felt oppressive, not the peaceful quiet of a weekend morning, but the hollow emptiness of a life suddenly stripped of meaning and direction. I lay in bed for an extra hour, not because I was tired, but because getting up would force me to confront the question of how to fill the endless expanse of time that stretched ahead of me. The routine that had anchored my existence, the predictable rhythm of coffee and commute and collaboration, had been replaced by a void that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating in its complete openness to possibility. The coffee ritual became a daily reminder of how thoroughly my world had changed. How the simple act of brewing a morning cup could trigger a cascade of memories and associations that left me feeling simultaneously nostalgic and bitter. For years, coffee had been preparation for the day ahead, fuel for productivity and social connection, the prelude to conversations with Marcus that had seemed genuine and meaningful. Now it was just caffeine in a quiet kitchen, consumed alone while I tried to figure out how to structure days that had no external demands or deadlines. One found myself making the same amount I'd always made, 2 full cups out of habit, and then staring at the extra serving like it was archaeological evidence of a life I used to live. The brands I'd chosen, the timing of when I prepared it, even the mug I preferred. All of these small preferences had been shaped by workplace routines and relationships that no longer existed. I tried changing my coffee routine, buying different brands and adjusting the timing, but everything felt forced and artificial, like I was playing at being someone new without any clear sense of who that person should be. The simplest daily rituals had become complicated by the absence of context, the lack of purpose that had previously given meaning to even mundane activities like caffeine consumption and morning preparation. The financial reality of unemployment hit faster and harder than I'd anticipated. Despite months of sensing that my job was in jeopardy and trying to prepare for potential income disruption, the 2 weeks of severance pay that had seemed reasonable during the termination meeting disappeared almost immediately into rent, utilities, and the basic cost of maintaining an adult lifestyle without any income replacement. I'd never been great at saving money, partly because my salary had always felt adequate for my needs and partly because I believed in the security of steady employment at a growing firm. Now I found myself calculating how long my limited savings would last, rationing expenses and cutting discretionary spending in ways that felt both responsible and depressing. The grocery shopping that had once been routine became an exercise in careful budgeting, comparing prices and choosing generic brands while avoiding the prepared foods and small luxuries that had made cooking feel less like a chore. I cancelled my gym membership, downgraded my phone plan, and started walking instead of taking rideshares. Small adjustments that individually seemed minor but collectively represented a significant change in quality of life. The psychological impact of financial constraint was worse than the practical limitations. The constant awareness that every purchase needed to be justified and every expense weighed against an uncertain timeline for finding new employment. The isolation was perhaps the most unexpected challenge. The way that losing a job also meant losing the social structure that had provided daily human interaction and shared purpose. I'd never realized how much of my social life had been built around work relationships, how many of my conversations and connections depended on the common ground of shared projects and office dynamics. The colleagues I'd considered friends seemed to evaporate once I was no longer part of their daily environment, as if our relationships had been more circumstantial than genuine. I waited for phone calls that never came, for text messages checking on my well-being or inviting me to coffee meets that would maintain our connection outside the workplace context. But apparently, the friendships I'd valued had been more about convenience and proximity than about real affection or loyalty. The silence from former colleagues was particularly painful because it suggested that my departure had been absorbed without any significant disruption to their social or professional lives. That I'd been easily replaced, not just in terms of work responsibilities, but also in terms of interpersonal relationships. Even Jennifer from accounting, who I'd helped through her divorce proceedings and supported during her mother's illness, seemed to have forgotten my existence once I was no longer available for daily interaction and mutual support. The job search process felt like psychological warfare, a constant cycle of hope and rejection that tested my resilience and self-worth in ways I hadn't expected. Each application required me to reframe my departure from Henderson in positive terms, to craft a narrative that explained my availability without revealing the circumstances that had led to my termination. I became expert at corporate euphemisms, describing my situation as seeking new challenges, or looking for opportunities to expand my skill set, while carefully avoiding any language that might suggest conflict or performance issues. The interview process was particularly brutal because it required me to project confidence and enthusiasm, while internally grappling with the betrayal and disappointment that had defined my recent professional experience. I sat across from hiring managers and tried to explain my qualifications and goals while suppressing the anger and hurt that threatened to leak through in unguarded moments. The constant rejection emails, when companies bothered to send them at all, gradually eroded my sense of professional value and marketability. Each "we've decided to move forward with other candidates" message felt like confirmation that perhaps Janet and Marcus had been right about my limitations, that maybe I really wasn't as competent or valuable as I'd believed. The job market in our industry was competitive under the best circumstances, and trying to navigate it while dealing with the emotional aftermath of workplace betrayal made everything exponentially more difficult. The nights were the worst, when the distractions of job searching and apartment maintenance couldn't mask the fundamental loneliness and uncertainty that had become my constant companions. I'd lie awake replaying conversations and interactions from Henderson, analyzing every detail for signs I'd missed or alternative interpretations of events that might make the outcome seem less inevitable. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by anxiety dreams about missing important deadlines or showing up to work to find my desk had been given to someone else. I started keeping a notebook by my bed to write down the thoughts and worries that would spiral through my mind in the dark hours before dawn, hoping that capturing them on paper would allow my brain to let go of the constant processing and analysis. The notebook filled quickly with questions that had no answers and observations that provided no comfort. Had Marcus always planned to undermine me? Could I have handled the Morrison meeting differently? What signs of Janet's dissatisfaction had I ignored or misinterpreted? The writing helped organize my thoughts, but it also reinforced the obsessive quality of my rumination. The way my mind kept circling back to the same painful territory without ever finding resolution or peace. I realized I was grieving not just the loss of employment, but the death of my faith in workplace, loyalty, and the naive belief that hard work and good intentions would be recognized and rewarded by people who shared those values. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the kind of dramatic awakening you see in movies, where someone has a single moment of clarity that changes everything. Instead, it was a gradual hardening, a slow accumulation of wisdom born from pain that eventually crystallized into unshakable convictions about how I would navigate professional relationships from that point forward. The woman who had walked out of Henderson carrying a cardboard box full of broken dreams was not the same person who eventually found her footing in a new job 3 months later. That woman had learned to read the subtle signs of self-interest disguised as collaboration, to distinguish between genuine support and convenient alliance, to protect her own interests with the same strategic thinking she'd once devoted entirely to helping others succeed. The lessons were expensive, paid for with months of financial stress and emotional turmoil, but they were also invaluable in ways that only become clear when you've lived through the alternative. I would never again mistake someone's need for my help with their commitment to reciprocal loyalty. I would never again invest my energy in building up someone who hadn't first demonstrated their willingness to invest in building me up. The naive generosity that had once felt like my greatest professional strength, I now recognized as a vulnerability that made me an easy target for people who viewed relationships as transactions rather than genuine connections. The new job came through a former client who had left Morrison Industries and started her own consulting firm. Someone who remembered the quality of work I'd done rather than the political circumstances that had led to my departure. Linda Morrison had been one of the family members in that disastrous meeting where I'd been labeled too emotional, but she'd reached out months later to tell me that my analysis had been exactly what their business needed, even if the delivery hadn't aligned with her father's communication preferences. She offered me a senior analyst position with significant autonomy and the opportunity to rebuild my professional reputation on my own terms. The irony wasn't lost on me that my salvation came from the very project that had been used to justify my termination, that the work Marcus and Janet had dismissed as flawed was valuable enough to serve as the foundation for a new career opportunity. But I approached this fresh start with hard-earned wisdom about the importance of establishing clear boundaries and expectations from the beginning. During the interview process, I asked pointed questions about decision-making structures, communication protocols, and performance evaluation criteria, making it clear that I expected transparency and reciprocal respect in all professional relationships. One negotiated not just salary and benefits, but also specific protections around project attribution and advancement opportunities, ensuring that my contributions would be formally recognized and that my career development would be supported through concrete commitments rather than vague promises. The most important boundary I established was around mentorship and support for struggling colleagues, an area where I'd previously given freely without consideration for what I might receive in return. I didn't become selfish or unhelpful, but I became strategic about how I invested my time and energy in other people's professional development. When new employees asked for guidance or assistance, I helped them, but I also paid attention to how they responded to that help. Whether they expressed genuine gratitude, whether they offered assistance when I needed it, whether they credited my contributions appropriately in their own work. I learned to distinguish between people who were genuinely struggling and needed temporary support versus people who were comfortable being dependent on others' generosity without developing their own capabilities. The difference isn't always obvious at first, but it becomes clear over time through patterns of behavior and reciprocity. Someone who truly appreciates help will look for ways to return the favor, will acknowledge your contributions publicly, will demonstrate growth and increasing independence rather than continued dependence. Someone who views help as an entitlement will take credit for collaborative work, will disappear when you need support, will treat your assistance as invisible labor that doesn't require recognition or reciprocation. I developed what I privately called the Marcus test for evaluating new professional relationships, a series of small experiments that revealed whether someone was genuinely interested in mutual support or simply looking for a convenient resource to exploit. The interview at my current company provided the perfect opportunity to articulate these hard-learned lessons about workplace loyalty and team dynamics, though I was careful to frame them in positive terms that demonstrated growth rather than bitterness. When the hiring manager asked about my experience working in teams and handling interpersonal challenges, I told a carefully edited version of my Henderson story, focusing on what I'd learned about the importance of clear communication, mutual accountability, and aligned values in collaborative environments. I explained that I'd discovered the crucial difference between being supportive and being taken advantage of, between being a team player and being someone who does everyone else's work without recognition. The conversation allowed me to establish up front that I expected professional relationships to be genuinely reciprocal, that I valued colleagues who were both willing to help others and capable of handling their own responsibilities competently. I could see the interviewer responding positively to this combination of self-awareness and boundary setting, recognizing that someone who'd learned these lessons the hard way would be less likely to create drama or enable dysfunction in their organization. They were hiring someone who understood the difference between collaboration and exploitation, someone who could contribute to team success without sacrificing their own professional interests or career development. The transformation in how I approached office politics and relationship building was perhaps the most significant change in my professional approach. A shift from naive authenticity to strategic authenticity that protected my interests while still allowing for genuine connections with deserving colleagues. I stopped sharing personal information or professional insecurities with people until they'd proven themselves trustworthy through consistent behavior over time. I started documenting my contributions to collaborative projects more carefully, ensuring that my work was clearly attributed and that any attempts to minimize my role would be contradicted by clear evidence. I became more observant about power dynamics and informal alliances within the organization, not to manipulate them, but to understand them well enough to navigate them effectively. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts about people's motivations and character, to pay attention to the gaps between what people said and what they did, to notice patterns of behavior that revealed true priorities and values. The signs that Marcus had been using me were always there. I'd just been too invested in believing the best about him to acknowledge what my gut was telling me about the imbalance in our relationship. Now I listened to those subtle warning signals, the feeling that someone was taking more than they were giving, the sense that my contributions were being minimized or appropriated, the recognition that someone was building their success on my invisible labor. When people ask me now about that difficult period in my career, about what I learned from the experience of being betrayed by someone I trusted and supported, I tell them that the most valuable lesson was understanding the difference between being generous and being a fool. Generosity in professional relationships should be strategic and reciprocal, offered to people who demonstrate their appreciation through actions rather than just words, extended to colleagues who are building you up even as you're building them up. Real professional partnerships are characterized by mutual investment, shared risks, and proportional benefits, not by one person constantly giving while the other person constantly takes. I learned to spot the warning signs of exploitative relationships, colleagues who never offer help but always need it, people who take credit for collaborative work, individuals who are friendly and supportive when they need something, but distant and unavailable when you need assistance. These patterns are predictable once you know what to look for, but they're easy to miss when you're focused on being the kind of colleague you wish others would be rather than responding to the colleague they actually are. The Marcus situation taught me that loyalty must be earned and demonstrated, not assumed based on hope and good intentions, and that the people most worth investing in are those who invest in you first, who prove their character through small actions before you trust them with significant support or sensitive information. Looking back now, almost 2 years later, I can honestly say that losing my job at Henderson was one of the best things that ever happened to my career, even though it was also one of the most painful experiences I've ever endured. The betrayal forced me to develop skills and awareness that have made me more effective, more respected, and ultimately more successful than I ever was when I was trying to succeed through pure hard work and naive generosity. I'm no longer the person who covers for colleagues' mistakes without expecting reciprocal support, who gives away credit for her ideas in the name of team harmony, who prioritizes others' comfort over her own professional advancement. I've learned to advocate for myself as strategically as I once advocated for Marcus, to invest in my own development as carefully as I once invested in his confidence building, to protect my interests as thoughtfully as I once protected his reputation. The woman who sits in this new office, in this better position, with this clearer understanding of how workplace relationships really function, is someone Marcus inadvertently helped create through his betrayal. He thought he was stepping on me to reach higher ground, but what he actually did was teach me how to build my own ladder, one that no one else can knock down because it's constructed from self-reliance, strategic thinking, and hard-earned wisdom about the true nature of professional loyalty. I should probably thank him for that lesson, but I suspect he's too busy enjoying the success he built on my foundation to appreciate the irony of how much stronger he inadvertently made me.